maple fans, lots of new maples to show you today, including how they grow at the end of the summer and a weeping variety towards the end of the video. So here we have Shayna, which has been a fantastic tree for me this year, and is one that at this time of year does tend to put on some nice new growth. So as you can clearly see, and it's difficult to see on some Acers where the new growth is actually, but on Shayna, because it's so red and so beautiful, really easy to see. And if we just have a look down here, there's a whole load of lovely new growth. This is entirely to be expected this time of year, and the thing to bear in mind is it's quite tempting to think, well, you know, they're going through a growth spurt, perhaps I need to add some fertilizer and stuff like that. But what we need to remember is that this new growth has to sort of last and harden off as we approach into winter, really. So that would be a mistake. There's enough nutrients in the compost really at this stage left to see this tree through. So but good to see, and some cultivars are sort of known to do this, and it's just that extra nice aspect of them that they give you a sort of little show of colour before the autumn. So Acer Palmatum Yukon here, another example where it's clear where the new growth is. So as we pan towards the top here, there we are, there's some really nice limey green coloured growth really. It really does stand out against the backdrop of the leaves below. Try and get a good angle there for you. It's amazing that even a tree of this size has got a little samara here, which is quite unusual. I just think it's been a really strange year in the UK. Very damp, very wet, very odd really. But for a tree this immature to sort of make seeds is quite extraordinary. But nonetheless, a nice showing of colour on Acer Palmatum Yukon. So here we have Twomby's Red Sentinel, and on this tree the new growth isn't that obvious by its colour, but it's sort of obvious because it does stand out against a backdrop. So this sort of pushes out new leaders, and on this particular cultivar it really does sort of, it's like a bloodgood that heads straight up, if you know what I mean. It's like a nice column. So in that sense, it's a really interesting growth habit. But there we are, you can see it sort of shooting out leaders, which I suppose in trees that didn't have this sort of upward genetic defect would go sideways. But here we can sort of see it's reaching for the sky and putting on some lovely new growth. So here we have Acer Palmetto mokushimo, and in this instance the new growth is evident, I think, because of the stems. So I think you can see the sort of redder, a different sort of stem colour. So they're a bit sort of greeny orange at the base there, but the newer stems are very colourful, and the petioles are very tiny stems at the top there are very, very vivid red, which is lovely. And sometimes you can sort of see that the tree has just taken you by surprise. So I just don't remember it being this big, really. So this is my sort of, the height of my tummy, really, something like that, which is a significant portion of growth. Now I remember this one last year, and it does seem to grow a lot and very late into the season. And again, it's got this lovely upright habit, which is fantastic. And I suppose that's why you see the growth even more, because all the energy is pushed, is spent pushing the plant onwards and upwards, really. But doing really well. Again, not a course to feed it, not a course to encourage it too much, because we don't want this to sort of get frosty and have a problem in the winter. But nonetheless, a lovely tree, and this one, wow, it just seems to have sprung up overnight, which is very pleasing. So on Crimson Queen here, it hasn't shot up. It hasn't done anything too dramatic. I'd say there's a little leader there has increased its height a little bit, but but it's almost like it's filling out. It's sort of becoming more dense. The foliage is sort of becoming a little bit more opaque to the camera and to the eye, really. So again, because this is a weeper, it's A, going to be quite slow growing, and B, it's going to spread, and the branches are going to kind of overlap each other, so the growth is a bit less evident. But certainly at this time of year, there's been a bit of increase there, so that bodes really well actually for next year, because I'm quite pleased with this tree, how it's doing. So here we have my Osaka Zuki, lovely tree, sort of classic big broad leaves, just fantastic really. And this particular one is a bit unusual. It's sort of spreading low and sideways, but I like that. It looks pretty cool to me. But just to show you again, if you look at the growth pattern at this time of year, the older leaves are developing a sort of reddish colour at this point, and if you follow the stems upwards, they sort of get a little bit lighter, and then finally right towards the end you can see the new ones. So you have to sort of look a bit harder if you like. It doesn't stand up quite so much, but there we are, clearly some nice sort of greeny new growth leaves against the darker red ones. It almost is acting as if it's autumn, to be honest with you. So whether that's something to do with the sort of conditions we've had here in the UK, but this tree is renowned for its fantastic autumn colours, so could be sort of an advanced sign of that really. I'll just show you another one over here, typical really. As you go towards the end you can see the sort of greener leaves, which indeed are sort of evident further into the plant really. So because these have reddened off in the sun a little bit, that's making the new growth easier to see. But that's growing quite fast actually, which is not unusual for this particular cultivar. So this is Acer Palmatum Wendy, and I think this is quite interesting, and hopefully we can learn from this, because the older growth here is doing well. It's nice little leaves on Wendy, which is lovely. And we can see over here where these have been in a little bit of shelter, there's some new leaves there. So they start out a sort of reddy green colour. It's kind of the opposite to some trees which have gone a bit red. But I think what we can see is that some of the extremities here have got a bit damaged and a bit burned. So it does sort of show that new growth can be quite tender. And as long as the sort of stems behind it are doing okay, and the branches, then that's all good really. But it's certainly not the time of year to take your eye off the ball in that sense really, because this new growth is important. It's sort of the foundations of next year, if you like. So I don't really have a problem with this. If a few leaves get lost, that's okay. But again, excessive amounts of sun at this time of year or high drying winds could indeed cause a problem. So this little fella's called Acer Palmatum Hagaramo, and this one's quite interesting, I think. I would say that the smaller trees tend to take the most advantage, or they seem to visually take most advantage of the sort of growth spurts and the growth seasons, which are this time of year and of course the spring as well. But yeah, you can see some really dark leaves on there. They're beautifully serrated actually. It's quite an interesting configuration. And then on the top there's clearly some sort of brand new, much greener, much brighter foliage, which is doing okay. It's doing really well. But I mean that's considerable. That's a lot of growth for an Acer at this time of year. And again, in these conditions, it's well shaded, it's well shielded from wind, etc. That will definitely help growth rates of these plants. If they're sort of damaged or they're in a difficult environment, they're just not going to put on the growth they will in a better setting, really. So here we have Benny Otaki. So just showing you some of the older, more established growth here. And then Benny Otaki does give you this lovely sort of red new foliage. It's so strange. I really should do a sort of time-lapse video of this, how sometimes these leaves sort of change over time. So there's the sort of very newest ones, which is sort of bold and red and quite fat really. And then it seems that that sort of grows out over time and sort of forms these longer elongated leaves. So like quite a few cultivars, they seem to sort of start in a bit more ordinary fashion, and the leaves gradually mature into the sort of the final result, which are extremely sort of spindly and very much based at the or connected at the base, and just the base. You see on this plant there's quite a lot of new growth, a little bit of burn there. I'm never ashamed to sort of show when things aren't quite right, because I think that's how we learn really. But for me, I mean, you know, I touch that and there's a lot of movement, so a warm breeze and stuff like that, that's going to cause an awful lot of dehydration. So I might just move that one back a little bit to give it a bit more protection. But in general terms of growing, it's doing really, really well. So in terms of Higashiyama, another sort of serrated leaf tree, but sort of more subtle serrations on it, which is really quite pleasant actually. Having said that, this is a most peculiar tree. It really is. The early leaves down here, the older leaves, shall we say, are sort of have sort of variegated edges to them in that kind of way, and then the sort of newer leaves are like this, a sort of a deep green with some serrations, and the new growth is absolutely bright lime green. So what an interesting, it's almost like having three trees all sort of stacked on top of each other really. So there's always an endless sort of variety of these cultivars, but this one's genuinely quite interesting in the way that it forms. This is a relatively new acquisition actually. I don't think I've done another video on this, and boy, that has sprouted up quite considerably. You see from the little red labels in there, it's quite a new acquisition. It's only in a fairly small pot, so that's sort of a good guide as well really. That's a sort of fairly small potty tree, and look how much it's grown just within 1 year really. But it's all a sign that it's happy and that it likes where it is. So I'd need a very good reason to move it somewhere else, I suppose. Another classic tree for doing interesting things this time of year. This is Orange Dream. So this is my other Orange Dream, the one that's in a sort of pot in the garden. And you know, in the summer you might wonder why it's called Orange Dream really. And there we are. It's the sort of new foliage has got this sort of greeny, orangey tinges to it, which is where it gets its name from, I suppose, really. But again, you know, you can see very, very clearly new growth, and a considerable amount of it, to be honest. So for a sort of pot-based tree, this is getting pretty big now, actually. Did repot it earlier this year into something a little bit more substantial. So, but if I just try and get in there behind, it's not an enormous pot, but this is where sort of potting on carefully and not leaping many sizes is the lesson I've certainly learned. It's really enjoyed the extra pot. The roots have developed that bit more, and it's come on really well. And for those that may have not seen these videos before, this is under sort of a shelter I've constructed, and it's about it's almost precisely a third bamboo, so I know that a third of the sunlight is filtered out, and that's exactly what Orange Dream really, really likes. So there's sort of no evidence of burning on this whatsoever really, which I'm really, really pleased about. But for a tree that burns so readily, it's one that you have to be a little bit careful with. But as ever, as my motto says, put the tree where it wants to go, not where you want to put it, and it's happy days really. Or a little sneak preview of some of the seedlings there, but we'll come back to that in another video. Just coming to a firm favourite, it's in all the garden centres, which is Butterfly. And if you look at the new growth on Butterfly, it is a slightly pinkier, slightly different colour. But this one sort of desperately needs shade in my experience. It really does benefit from being in this shady environment. It's by almost not exclusively so, but some of these sort of reticulated ones here just do need that sort of bit of shade that they require really. So how do I know this is grown? Because sometimes you just look at a plant and it's, hang on a minute, what's that doing over there? So there's a sort of you position your plants. I wouldn't have put plants this close together and allowed that to do that, so that is a lovely sign of some new growth actually. So don't be paranoid. It's not someone moving your plants around. Sometimes they just grow towards each other and sort of connect with each other, and that's just lovely, really. But yeah, doing quite well, this one. Very sort of off to one side. It's sort of weeping in one direction, which is just kind of interesting, really. And I don't mind that. I don't particularly want to mess around with this and stake it up or anything. So yeah, Acer Palmatum Butterfly doing well, I think. So Mana no Sato here is another one of these of my trees that it doesn't really evidence itself that easily that there's new growth on here. I think because it's like a big bush, it sort of there's no sort of leader that's heading up, or there's no sort of branches going sideways, but it's all growing, and that has just put on a load of growth this year. It really has. Yeah, that's done very well. Lovely curve in the trunk of the tree there as well. But it's lost its sort of purpley spring colour to some degree. You can still see some sort of variegation there. And yes, if you do look closely, the new leaves at the end are slightly different. But again, it's this one, yes, you can tell it's grown, you can tell it's happy because of its sheer size, I suppose, really. But yeah, really impressed with that. Again, it looks a bit plainer as the year goes on. However, in the spring, it's a lovely sort of purpley, fringy colour, so we'll look forward to that. So another sort of firm favourite that's available pretty much everywhere, Shinja Shoujo. The Shoujo is the Shoujo, and Shin's just a sort of new variant to it, so that was the one that was available, so that's what I picked. And this one really does give up its secrets in terms of new growth, doesn't it? Beautiful sort of dark green leaves, but quite clearly it's forming almost like little clumps of new leaves at the end, actually, which is really interesting. I think sometimes these can sort of overlap themselves, so I do occasionally sort of separate them a little bit to give them a little bit more space. Sometimes the wind can just blow things around a little bit. But again, from a small tree, it just shows if you buy a really good tree, a really good rootstock, pot it correctly, give it shade, give it just the right amount of water, etc., that a lot of growth is perfectly possible in a short space of time. This maple is one of the hardest to grow, so people say, and that was even, from the guy that sold me the tree, Amiga Sugar, which is well worth it if you can grow it, because it has the most gorgeous, almost unique coloured purpley variegated leaves, really. But how's she doing? I've got this tree in a lot of shade, a lot of, an enormous amount of shade, to be honest with you. There's a canopy above and there's things around it, and I think I've done the right thing. I think these variegated leaves are sometimes really delicate, but there's a lovely bit of new growth over there actually on this side. So again, because it's quite tender, you can see a little bit of damage to it, but overall I think that's doing really, really well for a tree that's notoriously difficult to look after. But hopefully that'll do well, and next year when I see Hilton again, my main Acer dealer chap, then I can give him some good feedback about this tree and just how well it's doing. So Ukigumo is always a favourite. It used to be difficult to get hold of, I think. Again, because it's become popular, because it's become popularised, it's now available from garden centres and all sorts of places, really. Really interesting tree, because again, it's one of these where the leaves start out in a sort of more palmate, ordinary kind of fashion, and you might be accused of thinking that's a bit of regression or something, and it's sort of, there's going to be a problem, and various branches are going to turn back to their sort of original palmate kind of setting, really. But no, because if it's taking place all over the place, as it is, that bodes really well. So strangely enough, you can tell this tree has got new growth on it because it doesn't look like it should be there. Kind of weird way of looking at it. Interesting that a lot of the new growth on this tree actually sort of internal to it as well. So again, it's quite a delicate tree. It's quite light leaved. Really do go easy on the water on this. I mean, normally I sort of flood fill things and wait till they're sort of desperate for water and flood fill them. But Ukigumo just seems to like, as advised really, to have the water spared. And it's interesting. I mean, that's sort of my tummy height. One of the trees over there, Higashiyama, was that already, not as bushy as this, but in 2 years. And you know, this is a much older tree, well, 4 or 5 years old. It just shows you these different growth rates can absolutely vary. So Benny Shishihenge, I think my pronunciation is not always the best, but that'll certainly do for me. And again, an interesting tree because the older growth has retained its lovely sort of small tiny leaves. It's pinky, it's greeny, it's very convoluted, very interesting. And the newer growth has actually got bigger leaves. Sounds a bit sort of back to front again really, but that's how it works. But you can clearly see, that's lovely. I mean, all that is new. It's sort of quite different to the underlying leaves that are below it. So that's a really good sign that we're putting on some growth and the tree's really happy. I mean, in general, you can't give Japanese maples enough shade if they like shade, so to speak. And this one, I actually suspect, because it's right on the outside of this little group of trees here, it would do okay in some more sun. I really do. But you certainly don't do it any harm at all by protecting it and putting it in some shade, really. So this little Aratama was one that I really stupidly overpotted last year, and thought I was going to lose it, to be honest with you. You can see some dieback at the tops. You know, that's sort of the plant being in distress really, and in the spring, and overwatering, and that affects the root system. We've done videos on that. But since it's kind of made the grade and it's grown into the pot, it's just done really well. So I'm so pleased. And you can see the sort of older growth here, which is green, and there's some lovely and a lot of quite dense new growth really. So even though the leaf shape is quite different, this reminds me of Shayna almost a little bit, where you've got some sort of nice coloured new growth, and it's quite a dense, compact little tree. And again, it's almost like it's buffered. If the wind blows, it kind of stops fairly quickly. So I think that's going to be a little tough one actually. It's basically a dwarf as far as I understand it. But you know, that's absolutely fine. But some of these dwarf trees can put on some good growth in the early years and then kind of slow down. So that's pretty cool really. So, you know, not a bit more of an unusual one, but Aratama is a firm favourite. And Wilson's, Acer Palmatum Wilson's Pink Dwarf. Again, one that struggled a little bit in the early part of this year in the UK. Very damp March, didn't really help matters. You still see dead growth there. I can clip that off actually and tidy that up a bit. But one of these trees where you think, well, what's the pink in here? I mean, why is it called Pink Dwarf? But you can see kind of white at the ends there, so that's good to see. Little pinky kind of edge leaves, which are absolutely lovely. And again, I can just see this sort of this is a Fatsia japonica, and that's touching. I wouldn't have put that there, so it's just extending out and sort of reaching up really. So again, probably a little bit over potted to start with, but that's going to be absolutely fine next year now because it's kind of grown into it. So Wilson's Pink Dwarf, a lovely little variety. You can just see there actually as well that the older stems are quite green. I think you can. And then again, the new ones are red. So this is all showing signs of doing okay really. Probably later on or whenever really, trim off this bed of dead wood, tidy her up a bit. And I think we're going to be in for a nice tree next year really. So here we've got Acer Palmatum Ruby Cascade, and if you haven't seen one of these, it's a kind of, it's a bit like the Crass Classic Ryusen, but it's been grafted onto a very long stem here, and then allowed to sort of cascade down. That's what it does. It's this sort of weird genetic variant that does this. But it seems to like where it is. And just having a look at the end of this little here, there we can see some new growth. So again, I think at this time of year, if you see new growth on a tree, it's a good sign. It's a good symbol of it's pretty happy really. So for a fairly new acquisition, Yeah, really happy with that. What I'm trying to get hold of next year, and I'm attempting to put a special order in, is for one of these which isn't grafted high. Some are grafted high like this, some are actually staked up, so they're grafted low but they're staked up so the stem grows up. So these would be staked up higher, and you can certainly carry on doing that. However, I want one that's actually low grafted and been allowed to fall over, because I'm going to have a go at putting that in a hanging basket. So one to look out for next year, if my Acer dealer is on the case. So hopefully I'll have a couple of examples of that for me next year, and we can do some sort of hanging basket type stuff with Acers, which would be hopefully quite interesting. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of these videos. If you are, if you could like and subscribe to the channel, that would be fantastic. And please hit the notification bell as well, because that way you'll know when I upload more. I'm really, really pleased with how things have progressed, and this little channel sort of growing quite nicely, really. So thanks to all those that subscribed already, and a special thanks to all those that ask questions or, you know, have ideas. And please let me know if you want any more different content, because we can do that. And I hope to see you soon in another video. Cheers.